welcome to the MessianTics podcast, a podcast about all things Messianic Judaism. Each episode, we will be sharing our opinions as we tackle some of the biggest issues in Messianic Judaism. Now, here's your hosts, Rabbis Eric, David, Jonathan, and Toby. Hey guys, welcome to another episode of the MessianTics podcast. We thank you for joining us and listening to us rant and rave about our thoughts of various antics that occur within the Messianic Jewish movement and from time to time the greater body of Messiah as a whole. With that said, we're continuing on the series on been in congregational leadership for questions and answers is time to respond and interact with those. Today, the question that was sent in is one that I think is actually very valuable for the Messianic Jewish movement as a whole because it's something that is pertinent. So that question is this: do some Messianic Jewish synagogues fall into the same trap that some churches seem to, and spend too much time, money, energy, and resources on paying for and keeping up with a building that's too expensive, utility bills that are too high, etc., which eats up a large portion of the tithe donation money when a smaller footprint, quote-unquote footprint, would allow the rabbis to be better compensated, have health insurance as part of their compensation package, and not have to have other income sources, while also making outreach and benevolence ministries easier to fund and maybe even exist in the first place. These are issues I've seen in the church for years, wondering if it goes on in the Messianic Jewish world as well. The quote-unquote, we need to keep up a certain standard, end quote, mentality with facilities seems to be common in the greater church culture and seems to actually be more about appearances for various reasons rather than being effective witnesses to a world in need. And then he said also, I recall on a previous episode of the Messianics podcast where a comment about jealousy over some congregations in Messianic Judaism have their own facilities while others may not was an issue for some. And I think this is a really important conversation to have because I think it also broaches another angle of that, which is it actually of value to attempt to keep up with the Joneses? And so this is a... we've talked about it before. There are very few Messianic synagogues that have their own facilities, their own property, their own building, especially in the U.S. I think the same is probably true in other countries as well. There are very few that have their own facilities. I think if we took a few minutes to count it, we would probably have maybe 25 or less that we could think of offhand. There might be a few others that we're not aware of. But no more, I would think, no more than maybe 50 or so in the U.S. that have their own building. The question becomes, do we have a building because we want a building? Do we have a building because we need a building? Do we have a building because we're trying to keep up with something? Or, and this is the other side of it, because most often, and this was our experience, this was Bradam's experience, we buy a building that was likely previously a church, right? And then you've got to retrofit it to make it not look like a church anymore. So then how much money are you rolling into that? How much money are you putting into that versus other things? And I think there's a wide swath of conversation to have here that is of great value. So I'm going to toss that out, let you guys dive into it, and then we'll see where it goes.
Part of the reason I think it can be so wide is because, I think the church faces that problem of like, oh, maybe we're focusing too much on the building. Yeah. I would argue that in the Messianic world, it's entirely the opposite. In most cases, there's almost zero focus on the place of worship. Yeah, you got some Hebraic art hung up in a back room somewhere that you're renting from the local church that you're friends with. But beyond that...
Felt banners.
Yeah, felt banners. But don't be knocking the felt banners now. But, there's
Hebraic font signs.
Even if they're very crowded, maybe sometimes it's just out of they're kind of afraid of taking that next step to like, oh my goodness, like we have enough people to purchase a building, but I don't know if we should purchase a building. Like, is that a wise move on our part? What if we purchase a building and there's enough people that disagree with that decision that it becomes
a split problem.
Yeah, then all of a sudden we had 200 people who were giving faithfully every month, and now we have 60 people who are giving faithfully every month. So,
well, what's really interesting with that is
the other side of that is it also depends on the area you're in.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because like I know like we were with Chevelle Sorel in Long Island for 5 years in New York, and when we got there, they had been around for almost 2 decades already. But the real estate market in New York, it was virtually impossible for them to buy a building. It wasn't a lack of want to. It wasn't a lack of numbers in people giving and number of people in the congregation. It just was not feasible. The dollar value of real estate in the market was insane. And what ended up happening was this church that was kind of Hebrew Christian-esque, had their leader who had been there for years had died. And so they gave their property to Shuvah Israel. And so Shuvah took that and retrofitted what needed to be done, upgraded what needed to be done, did some maintenance that had been left undone and things like that, got it up to par where they could use it. And then shortly thereafter, another Messianic congregation in the area approached them and said, hey, what if we just merged in with you and gave you our building, which was a bigger space, better facility? And so they ended up with two overnight, it seemed like, with 2 buildings, both of which had kind of a historic Messianic Jewish presence and so on. But I also know of congregations like in Boca that they had substantial amount of money saved towards a building. But again, and they had a good sized congregation. Right. But again, the real estate market was just so difficult that even with their substantial amount of money saved for a down payment, it wasn't feasible. Yeah. And then you have situations like ours where we bought a building or we were buying a building that was we were buying it for 50% of what the actual market value was. We were getting a steal on it. But then finance companies, and we had good down payment, but because we were so young, banks wouldn't deal with us. And then we actually went to finance companies that all they do is finance churches. Like that's their only purpose, is to finance churches, houses of worship. And we went to them, we were like, hey, here's what we're looking at. Here's what we're dealing with. Can you help us? And they just straight up said, we won't touch you. We won't touch a deal that's less than $1 million loan to value. And we were like, so you're going to penalize us because we're buying a building we can actually afford? Like, that's idiotic. Yeah. That just doesn't make sense. Aren't you supposed to be believers? What is this? And so there are definitely some complications and difficulties. We've slowly started to come close to outgrowing our space currently. Now, we have the ability to build in the future. We have the space for it, which is great. But we kind of toyed with the idea, well, let's look at what else is out there to see if there was something that could suit our needs more immediate. And we were like, dude, we couldn't even pretend to afford anything out there now. Even if we sold our place, we couldn't scratch a down payment necessary to purchase something else in our area right now, because in the last 13 years, it has exploded and real estate values have gone nuts.
Expensive. Yeah, and my experience with Messianic synagogues, my first Messianic synagogue, or actually second that I attended. The first one that I attended rented a fellowship hall of a church. The second one that I went to and stayed at was Dothan Messianic, which is in Dothan, Alabama. And it's they rent a building. They're still in the same building, and they have fixed it up real nice and everything. I think it used to be a tanning salon. Basically, it's kind of like a general purpose business building. It's got several different rooms, a little upstairs loft area, a back bay area, and they've just kind of have built it up really nice over the years to become. But they still rent. They don't own it, and it's maybe it's probably half the size of y'all's synagogue at CMC. And then I traveled to visit a friend in Houston, and that Saturday I went to Beth Yeshua, which is a very nice Messianic synagogue.
It is nice.
And it was my first time kind of being like, oh wow, this is the potential.
Sure.
This is what Messianic Judaism could be in regards to its synagogues. Because up until that point, I had only really known and seen home fellowships, and again, people renting fellowship halls or buildings. Nothing quite of that substance. And then, of course, I came to Berdam and was like, wow, this is impressive too. This reminds me of Beth Yeshua. It's this very nice, building that they own, and that there's a bit large congregation too that comes with it. So, I think in the Messianic world, it's the opposite problem. I think sometimes And again, I don't think it should become this lust for like a bigger, better building that has all the big bells and whistles and everything, all the electric, all the super up to date electrical, musical, electrical stuff. But it does need to be something that you can, when you invite people to, and you're like, yes, this is a place where we worship the God of Israel, we worship His Son, and it's a place where they go, oh yeah, this is a place of worship. It is a place that has been beautified and set apart as ground upon which God is given praise. So
yeah, I think that you touched on what I was thinking about by saying that the lust for.
Yeah.
I think with anything with the Lord, as an individual, but also as a corporate ministry, the devil is always in the details. Literally. I mean, it's always about the why, Right. I mean, if we look at I'll plug the podcast, The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill. Mars Hill Church in Seattle, and if you've not checked out that podcast,
it's a good one.
It's a good one. I would recommend it. I think not just leader in ministry, whether you're church or Messianic, but every believer should listen to that and know that could happen to you and that could happen to your place. But here's the thing. So they started off as a Bible study with 6 people in a room.
Right.
And the next thing you know, within a certain number of years, they're at Quest Field in Seattle, thousands and thousands of throngs of people. And internally, by that point, they're falling apart.
Yeah. It was I think they grew to that size within a decade, I think.
They're falling apart. And so I think the why is a lot of why you want the building, because there can be this sense of, I personally have experienced a sense of loss at a particular congregation where we were at a church. We were renting a church, and then we went to a building. And I can't help but look back and remember the most vibrant, powerful moments were when we were in that little church. And then something was lost when we got into a building. And I'm not saying that buildings are bad, because I've since been to 2 congregations that have had their own building, and there's that vibrancy in that. But I think that it has to be prayerfully, slowly considered, like anything. I was for some reason on the way here, I was thinking about just how the children of Israel and people in the Bible would go through periods of waiting, and then suddenly God would move on their behalf, and it was just so quick. Like
right.
the time it takes to set up dominoes versus the time it takes when you push that one and everything starts falling into place. It takes longer to set them up. I think of children of Israel's, their time in Egypt, and then suddenly God shows up, and then it's one thing after another. It's one thing after another. I think of Hannah, how long she prayed for Samuel, and when Samuel came on the scene, Israel's destiny changed rapidly.
Right.
And I'm not saying that that's a pattern always with God, but it's very, very true that oftentimes with God, the preparation is slow and arduous, because God is saying, because when I show up to actually tip the domino, it's going to move very quickly. And I think some people go for buildings and things like that and expansion way before they're ready for it.
Sure, yeah.
Way before the health of the congregation is not at a place where they want to take their infrastructure to a place that their health's not at.
This is an interesting topic, and it's actually a little awkward for me to talk about, because we do have a multi-million-dollar building and property. But at the same time, we have a congregation that needs the size that we have. It's not that we're in a building that's, we have 10 people in a 1,000-seat auditorium. And we're actually trying to expand our building right now, at least our fellowship hall, so that we can seat more people in the fellowship hall. We started out as a congregation meeting in a church fellowship hall, a church sanctuary, and then we moved to hotel meeting halls, and then we moved from there to another church's facility in their fellowship hall, and then we bought our first building, and then we moved and rented the building we're in now, and then we bought that building, and step by step. But I will tell you that you can listen to the last 10 years or 8 years since we've been buying the building, I think it is, our messages, our services, and you'll find that there's almost no pleading for money, no begging, no, if we, it's God provided the needs as it went, and in the next few months we'll be debt free in our current facility through the generous giving and God's blessing in our. And I'm not saying that to brag. I'm saying that that we can look and see congregations that were following the leading of God, and so it was about what God was doing, not about what they were doing. And we can also see, and I don't know which particular congregation you were talking about, Toby, but I have watched as congregations that were vibrant and growing and seeing people come to faith and building, that got a building and it went from being about God and being about love and people and became about our building and our success and what we're doing. And that transition, even though they now outwardly look healthy and well and they've got numbers and they have all that, they lost the character and the dynamic that brought them to that place.
Become whitewashed tombs.
Right. And so it's one of those things we're talking, as Rabbi David was saying, their congregation is growing, and thank God for that. And they're looking at, okay, what do we do when we get to the place where we need to build another building or build bigger or whatever. We're at a place in our congregation where, okay, do we build a balcony? Do we build another building? Do we separate into two congregations so that we use the congregation we have now and build another congregation in another community so that it can grow there? Because we are in a place where property values are going up and costs, and so it might be less expensive to buy a smaller facility for a smaller group than build a bigger facility for a bigger group. And all of those decisions come in, but you have to actually hear from Adonai about what to do and not lose the simplicity of worship. And it's about God and it's about God's people. And if it starts being about you or your success or bragging rights or comparisons or anything like that, it becomes a problem. I know some of the more successful or for instance, Rabbi Eric Carlson's congregation in Virginia, they meet in a church, but they have 300 or 400 people that come to service in that church. They couldn't find a facility there that they could actually buy that would meet their needs. Yeah. So for them, having no facility of their own and using a rented facility is the only way that they can do, whereas there's other places that have been able to acquire property and stuff. And the truth is, when I became a rabbi, almost nobody had their own facility. There were only a handful. Now there are more and more. Now it's not the majority yet, but it is still more and more of congregations that have their own. For instance, of the congregations that were started in this area, the Beit Israel has their own building, Mayim Chaim has their own building, Israel has their own building, we have our own building. So the ones in our area, almost all of them own their own facilities. The congregation Beth Hallel in Birmingham has their own facility, Beth Hallel in Atlanta. Several congregations, there's one in Corona, California, one in Syracuse, New York, and one in Buffalo, New York that I know of that actually bought what were formerly synagogues, traditional synagogues that have now using and are Messianic. So, but it depends. I think a big part of the question is, can you afford to do what you're going to do without robbing other things? In other words, are you at our congregations? Again, we've been blessed, and again, I'm careful to say this because I don't want to sound like we're bragging, because we're not. But we have a staff that we actually pay salaries. And we have an assistant rabbi that we pay him a salary, and I have a salary, and we have somebody that does our yard and maintenance outside, and he gets a salary. And we also give money to missions and support orphanages and do things. So, and we have insurance for our employees available and things like that. So we are trying to do what this question was, we're not robbing Peter to pay Paul so that we can do the things that we're doing. And but there are congregations that don't do that, and they're not taking care of their rabbi because they're paying for a building, and they're not taking care of their worship leader because they're taking care of their building, and they're not taking care of their youth. The youth are out selling candy every month so that they can have a youth event because they don't have a budget to take care of their youth because they're top heavy building wise or top heavy other things wise. And we have to learn to balance this out.
Yeah, one of the prime examples, this isn't necessarily a congregational example, one of the primary examples of where this can go south is actually the college that my wife and I went to, Nyack College, when it was in New York. They had, I want to say it was 130, 140-year-old college, very active, very, productive, growing, respected school. Their education department, if you graduated with a degree in education from Nyack College, you had a guaranteed job in New York and New Jersey. It didn't matter. Like, they just knew that the teachers were so well equipped coming out of there. It was a guaranteed lockdown job, no worries. They had a very historic property in Nyack. Most of the buildings were 2 centuries old or so, or more. Very old, definitely cost a lot of money to maintain, but they owned them completely outright. They had zero mortgage on them, which made maintaining them a heck of a lot easier. And then they decided to open a campus in Manhattan. And so in order to open the campus in Manhattan, they mortgaged the campus in Nyack to do so, thinking that they would be able to balance it out and get it all squared away. Well, they ended up going so far in debt that they could not bounce back from it. And the $1 million+ a year in maintenance required for the historic campus in Nyack made it impossible to do anything. So then they ended up closing down the Nyack campus and migrated everything to Manhattan. Because the thought was the Manhattan campus is newer, not as much upkeep, not as much whatever. So they migrated everything to Manhattan. And then they had to change the name because Nyack College, not being based in Nyack, New York, doesn't make sense anymore.
Right.
So they changed the name, and they still, even after selling off the Nyack property and all the things that went with it, they still ended up not being able to financially bounce back ever. And they ended up last year losing their accreditation. And so at the end of the school year of 2022-2023, they shut the school down entirely. And it was because they couldn't bounce back. They had put themselves in a position trying to expand, trying to develop, trying to grow, that they lost what was part of their identity and what they owned outright in order to expand, to take on bigger and better things and whatever. And whether or not that was a direction God led them or not, I can't speak to that. But what I can say is that they're not there at all anymore.
Right.
And so either it wasn't of God, or
God was like, shut it down.
Or they misoperated, they mishandled operating it or what have you. But either way, what ended up happening was a really phenomenal school that had a historic presence ended up closing down because they got ahead of themselves financially and couldn't bounce back. Couldn't keep up with maintenance, couldn't keep up with salaries, couldn't keep up with anything. And I think that's a consideration that has to be kept in mind in congregational planning, in planting, in budgeting, in organization, and so on. Is if you're going to have a congregation that's going to grow, that's going to be effective, that's going to be long-standing, then there are certain things that need to be done. You need to eventually get to a point where you're paying your rabbi, your pastor, your staff, what have you, where they're actually getting what they need to live. But you also need to be able to do the things that you're supposed to do in your community and outside of your community. You need to be able to be generous and gracious and caring.
Even if the expectation for your leadership is, hey, we're a congregation of 80, we do not expect a full-time pastoral role from you. We expect you to prepare sermons and to loosely organize the worship schedule for Shabbat, and then you're just getting paid part-time. Maybe not a full-on salary, but those expectations should be set up by the elders, by the congregation. We're not looking for you to be making hospital visits at 2 a.m. twice a week. We're looking for you to be someone who leads where we are currently. now while we grow and eventually maybe move on.
But I think one of the core realities here is that I think there's great benefit to having a building. And I think what Rabbi Toby and Rabbi Eric were talking about, like, you can't lose your identity once you get it.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
Right? What made you what you are has to be a part of, like, Rabbi Jeff Seif was with us at our congregation a couple of months ago. And as he's leaving, he goes, you guys have a really good thing here. He goes, like, you've thought through everything. Everything is planned out, and there's an intentionality behind it. He goes, but the thing that really stands out to me is that you've intentionally built something here where everybody is part of a family. Mm-hmm. And, whether it's the service or it's having the plush Torah scrolls for the kids in the Torah service, or it's the breakfast before service, or it's the oneg after service, or it's the kids running around on the playground, or whatever it is, it's like people just don't want to leave. Right. Like, you've done something good here.
And I think that's the key is that we have to always, and to answer the original question, the question is the building there for the people,
right, or
are the people there for the building?
Right.
And when people come to our synagogue or yours, because you guys have the similar experience, they rarely, when they leave the synagogue and we ask them, what'd you think? How was they rarely say, "Oh, your building is beautiful," although our building is very nice.
Yeah.
Their comments are always, "I felt so welcomed. It's a family environment. There's joy in the service.
Right.
The message was sound. The exuberance of the worship. The number of children you have. Those are the things that people walk away with, even though we do have a nice building. And you guys have a nice building also. And so I think that is the meter or the metric for if you're doing things in a way that is balanced, is when somebody comes to your building, the building is a tool, not the primary. It's not the focus. It's not what, we're not known for our building. We're known for our fellowship, for our onegs, for our services, for the dance, for the worship, for those things.
I think that it's about the perspective is so important because the people aren't there for the building. I think the building is there for the people, because here's another question, like, we want to have a building that just glorifies God. Well, here's the thing. In 1 Chronicles 17, because I was just looking that up, I was looking for it, when David says, man, I'm in a house, God's in a tent, and God said, David, I've never, David's like, he's like, David, I don't need a house. And what's interesting is God followed up by saying, he goes, I've never asked for a house. He said in 2, he goes, I've always moved from tent to tent. It was this expression of God saying, David, here's how I work. You're not going to put me in one place.
Right.
I can't be in one place. He goes, I've always moved from tent to tent. And I think that, in fact, I think God did his most powerful things with Israel when they were tent dwellers.
Yeah.
And I think that there's something in that, and I'm glad that David qualified what he said, because I'm not speaking against a building, but I'm speaking against the mentality that I think that God corrected David on, when David was like, I'm in a palace, God's in a tent, let me build God a house.
Right. And I think it's important that we recognize that what makes our places a place of worship is the presence of God.
Yeah. Right.
And that our buildings are not the temple. They are just tabernacles.
Yeah,
They're just dwelling places where people can gather together in the presence of Adonai. And when we lose that, when it becomes about the building, when it becomes about the facility or the beauty of it, or it wasn't that God didn't show up when Solomon built the temple.
No.
I mean, when we read about the dedication of the temple, it was a powerful experience that God showed up at. And the people built a beautiful facility for God that was thought by... people traveled from other nations just to see the beauty that was the temple for the living God.
Right.
But they lost that when it became about the building. And not about the people and the presence of God meeting with the people.
I will say we do have to be careful with how we, and I'm kind of picking the opposite position here about the desiring the building. Not that y'all are saying no to buildings, but you have to remember too, we live in a very different time to when the building was very important to the local congregation, particularly in the centuries following the ascension and the loss of the temple, because when you have a populace in most of the world that does not know how to read or can't, nor do they have access to reading material if they could read. These buildings are decorated with, facades and frescoes and mosaics and stained glass and things that tell the stories and remind them of the stories of, who are we here for? Why are we here? Who is Elijah? And you see there's the giant, painting of, Elijah, with the prophets of Baal in the corner there, and I've heard that story being read, and I see the image in front of me, and I can tell my children about it at home. I don't have to read them out of a book. One, because I can't read. Two, because I don't have a book. So we have to be careful too that because a lot of times, not saying that we're necessarily doing that here, but there are, particularly in some Christian groups, there is this anti-building mentality that, again, not that that's what we're doing. But it does exist where it's like, well, it's all about the presence of God, and as long as we have His Word, and it doesn't matter where we meet. And it's like, okay, today, yes. 600 years ago, it absolutely mattered.
No, I agree with you. I'm just saying,
and I know you do.
No. I agree with you, and I think Rabbi Eric said it when I brought up the temple. Rabbi Eric said, the temple was a beautiful thing and God showed up.
Right.
But they lost something. Here's the thing.
Right.
The temple, and I know Rabbi David talks about this. He actually has some
I was
pretty
just about to touch on it too. Yeah.
Controversial, and I'll let you go into it. But Rabbi David said, actually, I think the temple brought more problems than solutions because, well, for one thing, Solomon used forced labor to build it. There were problems before it even was completed. Yeah. And so God showed up. Well, yeah, because God's merciful. But He used forced labor to build it. And then, of course, by Yeshua's day, it had become a marketplace. And that makes me think of some of these churches that are like Shredder's Lair, that have gyms and coffee shops and skateboard ramps and stuff. And I actually heard a preacher at a church who...
Wait, are you saying we can't put a gym in a CMC?
I'm just saying, I remember I went to a church years ago, and the guy was like, he wanted skateboard ramps, and he wanted it to be like a concert. And I'm like, okay, see, this is like what happened to the temple.
Right.
That Yeshua came in, and he was none too happy. So then
So here's my thing with the tabernacle and the temple, and I think that this feeds so much into the conversation, is God commanded a tabernacle, right? It was a temporal dwelling place. It was somewhere where His presence traveled with Israel. When Israel went to war, the ark went with them. When Israel traveled and journeyed, the ark led the way because the presence of God was on the ark. But then we built the temple, and the presence of God was there in the first temple. It wasn't there in the second temple because there was no ark in the second temple, but the presence was in the first temple. And when we built the temple, we started doing things like, okay, God, we're going to go to war now. We'll see you when we come back. And we left God behind, right? We started go on journeys and travels and go on trading routes and whatever. Okay, God, we'll see you when we get back. I think the key to all of this conversation on whether a building is beneficial or not comes down to, when people come to your building, are they coming to meet God and then go home? Or are they coming to meet God and take God with them?
Right, and again, that goes back to what I said earlier. That are the people there for the building,
right,
or is the building there for the people?
Maybe another better way of wording it is: are they going there to meet God, or are they going there to bring God?
Yeah. Well, I like what you said about
because that's the whole reality of, Paul talks about how the Spirit has knitted us as individual believers together to be the Mishkan, the tabernacle, to be the temple. So are we as individuals actually bringing the presence of God with us to the building and leaving with the presence of God amplified? Or are we going there to encounter the presence because we're not in it on a regular basis?
I like what you said about being a tool, because I'd heard it said one time that, because there are a lot of people who are like, well, I don't need to go to church, I don't need to go to synagogue, because I don't need to go to a place. It's like,
I can do this at home.
You can get water anywhere in the wilderness, but sometimes it helps to have a well to go to, a specific place where water is drawn from, and so I like that, looking at it as that
where animals aren't peeing.
Yeah, we're looking at this as specifically as a place where you go. We are going here for the worship of God. We are going here to learn about the Word of God. We are going here to to pray and to fellowship with those around us.
Right. I've been to places, especially when I used to travel, where they took up the offering for 45 minutes and then gave 10 minutes to give the message, because they needed to have the funding in order to be able to survive. And I think that when it becomes that way, when it becomes about raising money, about paying for the bills, about doing that, instead of about feeding the people, spiritually and physically, that we lose the purpose. So a building is a valuable asset if it's about the people.
Yeah. And it has to be about your local people.
Yeah.
Here's my
not that you can't feed into others,
right?
But you need to primarily focus where God's placed
for example,
you.
when I was at Dothan Messianic, we helped a congregation in Uganda build their own school and like build a shul. For y'all helped with that as well. That project. But so not that we can't do anything internationally, not that we can't do things for folks across the world, because we have the ability to do that today. But if your local community, like if you are a city organization, you have to feed the people in your city. If you're a state organization, you have to feed the people in your state. If you're a national organization, you have to make sure that people in your nation are being fed and supported. Because otherwise, why do you exist? You need to change some things, if that's the case. So
right, and we've said it before that we as congregations fully support the outreach work of the organizations we're a part of that do things in Africa, do things in Israel, do things in the Ukraine, do things in Central and South America. But in the process, we don't want to see them forget about the local communities and congregations. The scripture actually says that it's great to do that other stuff, but first you have to start at the household of faith. You first have to make sure that whoever you're drawing blood from is staying alive so that
you're
they
not
can
leeching
produce
them
more
dry
blood.
and letting them die.
Go ahead.
I would like to know the statistics on the numbers of Messianic congregation. I don't even know. I don't even know. It'd be great, honestly, if we had somebody or some group that did studies on the Messianic movement, as far as what are the percentage of congregations that have buildings and which ones are tent dwellers. It'd just be interesting. I'd like to know that. I know there's a lot of Messianic, congregations that are probably home fellowships and things like that. It's just, but the thing is, I think it's an idea of understanding that when you have a building, and we have a building, and we're blessed, and you guys have a building, and you are blessed, but just because it's a level of success that, and I think we had mentioned before we hit record that there's been the subject of some congregational leaders being jealous of other congregational leaders over the issue of the building. The thing about it is, though, having a building is a level of success, but I think we lose sight of the fact that success brings its own struggles, because failure has struggles, but success has struggles.
And added responsibility.
Yeah.
And a building is only a metric of success. It's not the metric.
And it's not even close to the metric.
Exactly. And here's the thing, too, is when we look, since we've already brought the tabernacle and temple into this discussion, there were tithes given specifically for the purpose of maintaining the tabernacle, tithes specifically given for the purpose of maintaining the temple. There are numerous stories in the Tanakh dealing with either upkeep not being dealt with, the tithe not being collected for it, or money just sitting in a storehouse and never being used to maintain the temple. The reality is if God gives us a facility, there has to be a maintenance of it. We have to be stewards of it. I mean, that's just the reality. You have to be good stewards. But you can never, or I think you should never, put your congregation in a position where they have to choose between the mortgage payment, the maintenance and upkeep, or properly paying their people and sowing into the community.
Right.
Like, I think properly paying your people and sowing into where God has planted you to minister is a priority. The building gives us the extra stability for that purpose. But I can tell you, and I've worked in a number of synagogues across the country over the years, that all of them, at one point or another, have rented from a church,
Storefront.
with exception of one. But all of them, in one way or another, have rented from a church, and I can tell you that they were just as successful renting from a church as they were in their own space. But having their own space made life easier. Like when we were, I'll go back to we got hit hard with Hurricane Sally. Our building was almost just destroyed. Like We had close to $400,000 in repairs that had to be done, and like we were just a hair under the line where the insurance company goes, yeah, that's a total loss. We're not replacing it. A bulldozer's cheaper. Like we were.
I didn't even know that.
Just there, like a little bit more, and we'd have maybe one more tree on the building. It would have been the end of it, right? But there were some things that when we bought the property, the upkeep had not been done because the church was going under, and so there were a lot of disrepair issues that we were little by little trying to get to, and so the hurricane hit, and my immediate thought was, oh great, like how could God let this happen? And then as I started seeing everything that was going to have to be done in the repairs, I went, oh, this is how God makes it happen, right? Because everything that would have taken us years to get done got done in one sweep, and we ended up walking back into basically a new building, actually 2 new buildings, because we have 2 buildings on our property. But aside from that, the reality is when we had that 10 months while our building was being repaired, that we were transient and we were meeting in a church, and by the grace of God and relationships that he's allowed us to have, we had 5 churches within 40 minutes of us finding out about our building getting demolished. We had 5 churches reach out and say, you've got space here for as long as you need. Let us know when you want to start. And it happened that one of those was the best option for our needs and worked the best and what have you. And so we met there for 10 months. They wouldn't let us pay anything. They just wanted to be a blessing. But I can tell you, as much of a blessing as it was being with them, there are certain aspects of being a Messianic Jewish congregation that become more difficult when you're borrowing space, because you can't, like we always do 2 evening and morning services for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Well, that particular year, that wasn't going to be possible using somebody else's space. We had to pick one or the other. There are different things like that we had to like figure out how to navigate. Okay, well, we need, these are our needs, but we can't really do all of them. We have to make choices of what we're going to be able to do or how we're going to do it, how we're going to modify things, and what have you. It really wasn't the greatest thing. And looking back at it, when we were in that experience, it was like, oh, yeah, because we had our own place for a couple of years at that point. I was like, oh, yeah, I don't miss this at all. Like this, I don't miss this one bit. Like this is nice to be able to get back to our space and do what we need to do, what we want to do, when we need or want to do it. So there's a huge benefit as a Messianic congregation having our own space. Whether that's a rented storefront or it's your own property or whatever, there's a huge benefit because you don't have to tiptoe and dance around other people. You don't have to worry about stepping on toes. But for us, the other side of that too is, and it's been a real blessing not only to us but out of us, is that, and you guys do the same thing, is we recognize so many Messianic congregations either still do or started out renting from churches.
Right.
And we, and our congregation specifically, are so intentional on it's not our kingdom, it's his kingdom. And yes, we do things different than the church does. We act different. We do different. That's all fine and dandy, but we're all still part of one body. And so we are very adamant about, many churches have been blessings to Messianic Judaism. We have our own space. We want to return that blessing.
Right.
So we're now 3 churches deep that have rented from us over the years. And the one that's with us now has been with us for a couple of years and have been phenomenal. As a matter of fact, probably the best people we've rented to. But they've been phenomenal. We love having them there. They love being a part of what we're doing, being a blessing. They come to our Passover Seder every year. When we have work days, they're like, just tell us when to show up and we'll be there. Point us in the direction of what you want done. We'll do it. It really has been a mutually beneficial relationship.
And I just want to interject because they are using our facility. They don't have their own building. And I would like to ask Rabbi Eric, because I know you guys rent to a church, but I just wanted to interject on what David said because a very important detail about that situation is that church is busting at the seams. God is blessing them. They don't have their own building. And honestly, I look at it as like the Ark when it was at... what is it, Obed? When it was at his house, it's a situation like that. And I think sometimes, and I know it's hard to do and it's easier said than done, but sometimes you can't disparage that if you're renting from a church, that mutual relationship and why maybe God wants it that way. But, for us, we have a church renting and they can't control their growth. And I just think that God's blessing them because, well, 1, they're in Messiah with us, but 2, they openly recognize the one new man and they support Israel. and they're in a situation where they're blessing God's chosen, his firstborn. Right. And I think that they're seeing tremendous growth and blessing. I don't know if I'd like to know.
Yeah, we've had churches rent from us since we've owned our own buildings, both our previous facility and the one we're in now. And they're both, up until this month, we actually had two renting, one Lutheran church that was renting from us on Sunday, and a Methodist church that was renting on Wednesday. Both of them left their host organizations over biblical issues. And so we wanted to open our doors and be a blessing to them, and both of them have seen growth coming on. And again, it's this paying forward idea that we were blessed by churches that let us meet in their facilities, so we feel like we are returning that favor. But I also wanted to say, I know that there are Messianic congregations out there that don't have their own buildings, that look at congregations that do, and almost not necessarily with jealousy, but with a desire, like we're not fully what we could be until we have our own building. Like, we need to have our own building. But I want to say that when God opens the door, when you come to the door of getting your own building, all you have to do is knock and the door will open. You don't have to kick it in. And that's important, because I've seen congregations that kicked their way into facilities and then ended up struggling and suffering and even falling apart and just going away because they forced something that was not yet. Right. And so I want to encourage you, if you're a Messianic rabbi or even a pastor for that matter, and you're renting or you're in a storefront or you're whatever, and you desire your own facility, please wait on Adonai to provide the blessing. Yeah. Our current facility, when we were renting it, and we had made an agreement with the people that owned it to pay $1.4 million for the building if it came up for sale. And then we waited, and we were renting, and we were meeting, and we were doing, and then they decided that they needed to sell the facility, and they offered it to us, and we ended up buying it for $750,000. We ended up buying it for half of what we had agreed to pay for it, because we waited on Adonai to make it happen instead of forcing our way into buying something that could have caused us. I mean, trying to come up with the money to pay for a $1.4 million facility would have put a strain and a stress on us that would have been unattainable. But waiting on Adonai, we ended up getting a building that was worth $2.5 million for $750,000. Yeah. And so I want to encourage you, buildings are wonderful, and it's nice to have them and all that, but don't kick your way in. Wait on the Lord. He will provide, and don't do something just because you think you're less than. And I'm not talking in jealousy, but just in, we won't be a real congregation until we have our own facility. Right. Just don't accept that lie from the enemy. Yeah. And wait on Adonai to provide, and then you will have the resources to pay your rabbi a living salary, to pay your worship leader or your staff or whatever, to have a valid and viable youth program, to have all of the things that really matter. That really matter. And then your building is about the people, not your people about the building. Yeah.
And to kind of bring this to some conclusion, back to the question. Are there Messianic synagogues that fall in the same trap as some churches of tying up all their resources and all into a building? There may be. I don't personally know of any. Yeah. There are several that have very large, well-designed buildings, but they took significant amount of time building those. It wasn't like it was an overnight thing. Mm-hmm. Like Baruch Hashem in Dallas took years. Yeah. And they built in phases as they had the money and the resources and the need for the space. They spent several years with standing room only in their sanctuary. And people were standing in the doors with the doors open just to see and hear and worship. And before they were able to get to the sanctuary they have now. So there are several that have very large, nice, well-done buildings, but they aren't forsaking what needs to be done. And I can't speak for everybody and say that that doesn't happen across the board. There probably are some congregations that might be in that position. But for the general, on the general, my experience with those that own their own property is that they own something they can actually afford within the realm of what they still need to do in their congregation and from their congregation, which I think is huge. And I think most of the Messianic movement understands that we're a bit of a niche market. Like the difference between us and the church that rents from us. It's easier for a church to grow because it's not as much of an ask from people's lives. Right? Show up on Sundays, great. Nothing happens on Sundays. Well, we have service on Saturdays. Your kids' ball games are on Saturdays. Your favorite sports teams, your favorite races, your favorite whatever. Everything's on Saturdays. People go to the river on Saturdays. They go to the beach on Saturdays. Saturday is that day to do all the stuff you want to do. In order to come worship with us, you have to forsake self to come and worship with us, right? You have to give up all the things so that you can come and participate. So we're a niche market. We're never going to grow like a church does in that same concept. That's not to say we can't or won't grow, because we've experienced it. You guys, growth happens, but it happens in I would say a bit of a more kind of spiritually authentic way. Like it grows, it multiplies in a really unique way. And so as we grow, it's important to keep in mind that we don't need to try to be like the mega churches. We don't need to try to keep up with the Joneses. We don't need to try to be something we're not, thinking that's what attracts people in. I think what really attracts people in is God in your midst? Is God moving when people leave your building? Right. Are they leaving, taking the presence of God with them into their workplace, into their home life, into their school, into whatever? That's what changes lives and draws people in. And I think that's the difference between a Messianic synagogue and maybe some of the keeping it with the Joneses mentality is we're just trying to do what God put us here to do, what God called us to do. And when God gives us the resources to have our own space, great. We're going to try to continue to do what we've always been doing the whole time along.
Yeah, and if we as Messianic congregations start to try to be what we're not, that leads to the buildings that are too big, the finances that are too small, the wrestling with those things instead of understanding who and what we are.
Yeah. Well, with that, guys, we appreciate you joining us, and we hope that this conversation has been a blessing to you. I don't think our audience really understands how good it is for us just to hash some of this stuff out and think it through, talk it through, verbalize it. I think it's more, some of these episodes are more for us than they are for the audience, but we pray that it's a blessing for you guys as well. Thank you for the question, and we hope that you guys will continue to send more into us, as we really enjoy talking to what you already would like to know rather than just espousing random information hoping that it meets your needs. We'll see you next time. Bye.
Thank you for listening to the MessianTics podcast. Make sure to subscribe so you can be notified every time we drop a new episode. And be sure to follow and interact with us on social media at MessianTics Podcast.